My name is Rob Avis, and I'm the co-founder of Verge Permaculture here in Calgary, Alberta. Over the next 6 sessions, I'm going to deliver an introduction to permaculture, or a primer, so that you guys are ready to go when you get to the live version of the course. After teaching this course numerous times, what I've found is that students get a little bit overwhelmed when they get all the information at the same time. So the purpose of this pre-course is to get you guys familiar with the ideas and the theories so that when you get to the live version of the course, we can hit the ground running. Before we get into the content, I thought I'd introduce myself. So I teach permaculture design for 3 reasons. Number 1, I believe that if we want a green, clean, and sustainable future, and we want to progress humanity, we have to do it ourselves. We can't wait for corporations and governments to go and do that for us. That's our job. Number 2, I believe that the future that we're all wanting to move towards is not going to arrive through fear or messages of fear. I believe that it has to come through optimism and opportunity and positivism, and permaculture gives us the tools to do this. And number 3, I know that green, profitable business is possible, and so if we can actually encourage an army of people to go out and create livelihoods fixing the planet at the same time, it's going to happen a heck of a lot quicker. So I'm trained as a mechanical engineer, and I cut my teeth working in the oil and gas industry and industrial food industries. And ironically, it's those 2 industries that have led me to do what I'm doing today, which is teaching about local food and decentralized energy. Verge Permaculture started about 5 years ago, and since then we've literally trained thousands of students, and we've watched Alberta become an absolute hotbed for sustainability and permaculture overnight. The last place you'd consider something like that starting. Before we started Verge Permaculture, Michelle and I were both working as facilities engineers in the oil and gas industry. And we started to get this pit in our stomach. We weren't really sure why, but we felt like maybe we were contributing to status quo, and there were all these problems that we were seeing around us that we didn't have answers to. We almost started to believe this myth that you guys are probably all very well aware of if you're taking this course. And you've probably never put words to it. That myth is that humans are inherently destructive. So we weren't sure what to do. I audited a couple courses. I was working as a renewable energy engineer, kind of moonlighting while I was working in the oil and gas industry, not really getting any good answers. And sure enough, serendipity struck. A friend of mine sent me a 5-minute video clip called Greening the Desert. Greening the Desert outlines this story of a man from Australia named Jeff Lawton who went to Jordan, specifically to the Dead Sea Valley, and he turned this meaningless piece of desert with hyper-saline soils, so really hard growing conditions, hyper-arid conditions, nothing growing there, into this self-sustaining food system in a very short period of time using very low-tech techniques. And what I realized, well, I didn't actually realize it at the time, but a light switch went off in my head, and that video completely shifted the course of my life. And that light switch encouraged Michelle and myself to quit our jobs and travel the world. Now, since then, we've traveled to Western Europe, we've traveled to Africa, parts of the Middle East, Australia, lots of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, learning everything from renewable energy at renewable energy institutes to sustainable agricultural techniques to permaculture and everything in between. And the good news is that I absolutely know that humans are not inherently destructive and that we can put our life energy to the most positive things. So if the most destructive thing is the nuclear bomb, we don't actually know what the most positive thing is. And there's a ton of people out there who are working to fix the planet, and they're doing it in amazing ways. So the Permaculture Design Course is basically the culmination of all of this traveling, all of my engineering experience, brought into one course. And I'm not going to just sit here and tell you that humans are not inherently destructive. I'm going to give you case studies and examples of how we can be just as positive as we are negative. So you're going to get 3 things out of this design course. Number 1, I'm going to give you all the technique and strategies to go out and create regenerative landscapes, both personally and commercially. Number 2, I'm going to show you guys what I've been working on for the last 10 years, which is a framework for design. So this framework for design is applicable anywhere on the planet for pretty much any problem that involves ecology, which I would argue is every problem on this planet. And if this is the only thing that you leave the course with, you're going to be away to the races, because this framework is very simple to understand, it's very simple to follow through step by step, and it's going to allow you to always start solving problems right at the right place. And number 3, as I mentioned before, I'm a really big fan of green business. So if you are thinking about starting a green business, or you have a business that you want to transition to something more green, I'm going to inundate you with green business ideas over the course of the Permaculture Design Course, so that when you leave this course, you're going to have a really good idea of where you want to focus your energy. Now, these intro videos are going to be delivered to you via email. And within that email, we're going to have a homework section, and we're going to have additional resources. So I realize you probably all have busy lives, but we've tried to pair up resources that are appropriate to the content that we're delivering in these videos. And I would highly recommend that you take the time to look at those resources well before you come to the course. By doing this, you're going to prime your brain, you're going to understand the basics of permaculture, and we can leave all of that theory behind and get straight in to the core content within the course. So without further ado, let's get into some of this material. So the objectives here, number 1 is to provide you with an alternative perspective of agriculture and where we find ourselves right now as a species. Number 2, we've got an enormous number of problems that we face, and they can be really overwhelming. So I want to take those problems and simplify them down so that we can actually differentiate between the symptoms and the causes. And number 3, I'm going to talk about some fundamental pillars of permaculture. So I talked a little bit about this concept of myth in my introduction. And when I used that word, you probably were thinking, what the heck is he talking about? We all learned about this concept of myth, with the ancient Romans and Greek civilizations. And when I say myth, I just kind of mean a story, essentially. And so if we could think about humans as computer hardware and culture as the software, and mythology, the components that make that software up, the myths or stories that we tell ourselves direct how the hardware functions, essentially. And so if you're going into solving any kind of problem with this idea that humans are inherently destructive, the end point of that design or solution is going to be entirely different than if you have a frame of mind that we can be just as positive as we are negative. And so I think it's really, really important to understand this concept of mythology. Doing brain research and looking at some of the latest brain research, what people like Bruce Lipton have discovered is that when you are driven by fear, what happens is it actually shuts down your prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of your brain, and it doesn't allow you to come to good solution. So we want to reframe those myths in a way using stories that are real and true that we can actually grab onto to show how we can be just as positive as we are negative. So while there's plenty of cultures out there, and each of those cultures have slightly different stories, there's basically 3 stories that we all share amongst most of the cultures on the planet. Number 1 is that we're agrarian. So this idea that we have only one way of taking care of ourselves. And agriculture, as we'll see shortly, is probably not the best way that we should be taking care of ourselves. Number 2, we've already talked about that humans are inherently destructive. You see this in all of the language that we hear about right now. Whether you're reading Facebook or newspapers or internet or any kind of television program, there's this deep-seated connotation that we can't be positive. And what's interesting about that story is that the story is actually starting to shift a little bit now within the sustainability circle. And the shift is, okay, we are pretty destructive. There's lots of evidence about that. But maybe we should be changing our design to be neutral. So we get words like net neutral housing or xeriscaping. So a net neutral house is a house that captures just as much energy as it consumes, or a xeriscape is a landscape where they'll cover a lawn with things that don't require any water, like rocks and very, very low usage plants. Both of those are great, but they bring this connotation that at best humans can be neutral. And I think we have to go beyond that. And so these myths, like I've said, are perpetuated by the media. And I think that what this design course needs to do is show you guys alternative stories that you can grab onto so that we can start to reclaim that story. And I want to leave you with an analogy. For those of you that are canoers, if you're canoeing down a river, you need to be able to identify the landscape of that river, so what's coming at you. So you need to be able to look at the rocks no differently than you need to be able to look at the path that you need to take that canoe down. Focusing on a myth like humans are inherently destructive is like keeping all of your attention on the rocks. And if you keep your attention on the rocks, that's where your canoe goes. So what we want to do here is we want to frame a new story so that we can actually reactivate the thinking part of our brain and move towards the solutions so we're not focusing on all of the problems. So I talked a little bit about agriculture. Let's kind of break this concept of agriculture down into a couple of little components here. So about 10,000 years ago, we started planting seeds. Before that, nature would have provided us with food on a seasonal basis as required. And you know, especially in my province where I live in Calgary and within Alberta where we've got the oil sands, it's really easy for us to focus on problems like oil and gas and forget about agriculture. So let me just break agriculture down into its simplest form. Agriculture is a form of war on ecology. I know that sounds really extreme, but this concept that humans are inherently destructive is built into this concept of agriculture. So if you look at the pattern of agriculture, basically the pattern follows exactly in these steps. So first we find an ecosystem and we deforest it. So that could be a native prairie or it could actually be a full forest. I don't differentiate between a native prairie and a forest. The pattern is very similar. We deforest it, we plow it, and we plant into it, and then we desertify it. And that's nowhere that the place where this holds most true is the Fertile Crescent. So that was one of the most fertile, productive places on Earth where we first started farming, and now it's a desert. So the birthplace of wheat can't actually grow wheat anymore in Syria. So interestingly enough, we focus a lot of our attention on how bad oil and gas is and coal is and mining and all of these other things that do have problems associated with them. But we just forget about agriculture. And the chart that I'm showing right now beside me is basically a chart of GHG emissions comparing agriculture and fossil fuels. So within the fossil fuel category, that's including all the GHGs released from all fossil fuels from the beginning of when we started to extract fossil fuels from the planet. And it's comparing it to the GHG emissions of agriculture starting 10,000 years ago. And what's really interesting about this chart is that agriculture eclipses oil and gas from a GHG emissions perspective. Yet when we drive out into the country and we see these fields, we're just like, oh, that's so beautiful, it's agriculture. Look at all these beautiful canola fields. What's actually happening there is humans are waging a war against ecology. And even though it seems like we're kind of winning right now, once you start to dig deeper into the details, you realize that we're on this precipice and we're playing with fire. And we'll get into more of that within the course. And so it's really important to have an understanding of agriculture and where we're starting from so that we can figure out where we're going to go to. So I've talked about this idea that humans can be just as productive as we are destructive. I don't want you to believe anything I tell you. I think you need to go and do your own research in addition to what we're going to learn in these classes. And I want to buttress this information with case studies. So the case study that I'd like to talk about right now is Alan Savory. I've included a video in your homework for you to watch after this video, specifically about Alan Savory. It's a TED Talk that he's recently given, and it's gone absolutely viral on the internet, and for good reason. You'll understand when you watch it. Now, Alan Savory was a biologist working for the government of Zimbabwe, and in his early career, he was asked to go out and look at elephant populations to see how they were interacting with their ecology. Now, while he was doing this, the march from living rurally to living in cities was happening in Zimbabwe just like it was happening in North America. And as people left their rural settlements and moved into cities, the predator-prey relationship between humans and elephants changed. And so as that pattern shifted, so did the way that the elephants shifted within that ecology. And so the elephants actually started working against the ecology instead of with the ecology. And so as Alan Savory went out in to observe these elephants, what he noticed was that the elephants were actually causing massive amounts of destruction. This native animal from Africa was actually causing destruction on the ecology that it evolved in. And he couldn't figure it out. And he ended up recommending that they cull 14,000 of these elephants because in his simplistic view of it, they were causing damage. He had to get rid of them. He later talks about how this is the biggest mistake of his life. And what he realized was that without the humans living around these rivers and lakes and water bodies, there was no predators to keep the elephants away. And that analogy has been used to develop that analogy helped him to develop a system called holistic range management, which he now teaches all over the world. Multiple teachers teach all over the world. And it shows cattle producers how to manage their cows in the same way that humans would have managed elephants, or humans or any kind of predator would have managed any kind of herd on a landscape. And so this one design system has actually can reverse desertification, and it can show people how to take cows, which are common in sustainability circles, commonly demonized as this GHG, walking animals, these animals that destroy landscapes, into animals that actually build carbon in the soil faster than any other process that we've found, just by changing the pattern. Okay, so I want you guys to stop thinking, if you're thinking this, that this is bad, or this is bad, or this is good, or this is good. All of the things that exist on the planet can exist within a spectrum of good and bad. It's all about the pattern that we apply to it. And we're going to get really deep into that as we get further into this course. So most of you are probably coming to this course with a huge amount of baggage, specifically with regard to the problems that you've been researching. Peak oil, climate change. We could talk about this list all day long. We could actually spend the next 6 videos talking about problems, and we wouldn't be any further ahead. It's really important to understand the difference between symptomatic problems and root cause problems. When you can find the root cause problems, you can actually deal with the symptoms all at the same time. But if you constantly are trying to solve problems that are just symptoms of a root cause, you'll be there all day and you will never get to the bottom of it. Let me give you an example. Let's say I took a stick and I started hitting my head repeatedly. Over time, I'd probably get a headache. Now, most Westerners would just turn to their medicine cabinet and they would take Tylenol. Doesn't work. Then they'd go and take an Advil. Still doesn't work. Then they might move to Tylenol 3 or morphine. Nothing's happening. All I have to do is stop hitting my head. So what I'd like to do within this idea around problems is actually simplify those problems down to the most important ones, the ones that are going to basically solve all of these other ones simultaneously, the problems that are the critical path that if we don't deal with, we're going to be in deep, deep trouble. In order of priority, I haven't associated any numbers with this, but the bar graph kind of shows the priorities of problems here. Number 1, our biggest problem is soil erosion. 2009, the planet lost roughly 86 billion tons of this stuff. This is the most biodiverse ecosystem that we have on the planet, and without it, you can't do anything. It's what makes planet Earth. It manages all of our cycles. Number 2 is deforestation. Now, like I said earlier, I don't differentiate between a native prairie and an old-growth forest. They both have the same pattern, albeit that they're different sizes, but the diversity is the same, and the way that they function ultimately at a very pattern-based level is also the same. So deforestation. And number 3, pollution. Those are our 3 problems as a species today. Now, like I said, soil is the most biodiverse ecosystem on the planet, and within it, there's all the biology that we need to deal with all the pollution. So they've found mushrooms now, fungi or mycelium, which is the root network below the mushroom or the fruiting body that you can see when you're walking out in the forest, that will break down PCBs, that will hyperaccumulate radioactive nuclides, that will break down hydrocarbons. These things, this fungi uses those pollution sources as food. Okay? They've found bacteria that will actually lock up heavy metals and uranium in the soil, in situ, so that they're not accessible to the plants that we grow. And I could go on and on and on about all of the amazing microbiology that we found that actually loves to eat our pollution. But guess where they all live? They live within our soil ecologies and they live within our ocean ecologies. And we keep losing soil because we keep taking down forests. And as we take down forests, it exposes the soil, which then erodes it and sends it out to the ocean. Once it's in the ocean, it's very hard to bring it back up on land. So our directive, if you will, with regards to earth repair or regeneration of the planet is to put complex pioneering and stable ecologies back on the ground so that we can conserve soil and grow soil. We're going to talk a lot about how to grow that soil back very quickly. And as we grow the soil, rebuild that biological bank so that we have all the biology that we need to deal with the pollution that we've put onto this planet. And hopefully we'll stop producing the pollution at the same time. And within that, all those other problems that we talked about will start to get solved over time. So you're probably wondering what the heck permaculture is. I've got this mind map right beside me, which does a really good job of explaining the core pillars of permaculture. So number one, it's based on sustainability. This idea that we're going to create systems that sustain themselves and sustain us. Number two, it's based on this concept of permanence. So permanent agriculture and permanent culture. I would say that we have a very different thing right now. We have permanent or very transient culture and transient agriculture. Number three, it's based on ethics, and we'll delve more into those ethics a little bit later, but the ethics is a very key component to how this design system works. The ethics get brought into all of those other three areas, plus they get brought into this concept of design science. So permaculture itself is based in science. So I like to say that permaculture is a design system based in science, guided by ethics, inspired by nature, to the design of sustainable human habitat. So how do we take care of our needs without compromising the needs of the ecosystems around us? And that's basically what we're aiming to do. So we look at low energy housing, renewable energy systems, waste to resource systems, food production systems, and everything in between. So you're probably wondering who invented permaculture. Permaculture was invented by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. Bill Mollison at the time was a university professor in Australia, and David Holmgren was his graduate student. Together they came up with a thesis called Permaculture 1, which is a book that's still available today and is awesome. And since then, permaculture has become a global movement with somewhere between 1 and 2 million people practicing it on every continent, within every country, and it's pretty much terminal now. And being that it's open source, it's not possible to constrain it any longer. So it's a really exciting, fast-moving movement, and these two pioneers have done an amazing job at creating this design system. So in this presentation, we talked about this concept of myth and refocusing our energy on solutions as opposed to on problems. And we kind of redefined those three problems that we really need to be looking at, which is soil erosion, deforestation, and pollution. Number two, we talked about the root cause versus symptomatic causes within problems and the importance to be able to differentiate between the two. And number three, we talked about some of the core pillars of permaculture, so what creates this design system. And we're going to delve into that more in the next sessions.